Hi, welcome back, everyone. So now we're moving to our international panel, and thank you for continuing your participation, or active participation, and sending your questions in the chat, because I really hope to sprinkle some of your questions, also some of your interventions during this 1 hour discussion. So I'm truly delighted to introduce you to 3 accomplished executives that have kindly accepted to share the wealth of knowledge to continue the conversation with us today. So first, we have Rebekah Saltsman. Rebekah is the CEO and co-founder of Finji, an independent development studio and publisher. Hello, Rebekah. Thank you for being with us.
Hey, good to be here.
Tell us a little more about Finji.
Yeah, of course. Finji is a small independent development studio and independent publisher based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We have internally developed Overland. Back in the day, we also made Cannibal, which is sort of the kind of first endless runner on mobile. And over the past few years, we have launched several publishing titles, including Night in the Woods, Wilmot's Warehouse, Feist, and then in the next year or two, we have Chicory, Tunic, and a few unannounced titles on the way. And yeah, I run the studio with my co-founder and husband, Adam Saltsman.
Good, thank you so much for being with us. We also have Zac Antonaci, who is the Director of Publishing at Frontier in the UK and has been working in the games industry for nearly 15 years now. Welcome, Zac.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Where are you? There you are. Hi, tell us more about what you do at Frontier.
Sure. So I'm the Director of Publishing, as you mentioned. So Frontier Developments are a 600 roughly person studio based in the UK. Develop and self-publish titles best known for Elite Dangerous, Planet Coaster, Jurassic World Evolution, and Planet Zoo. And then this year we also announced the launch of our games label, Frontier Foundry, which is where we work to support and partner with other developers to bring their games out to market. We announced with 2 studios from Montreal. One that's launched was Struggling, which won Best in Show last year at MEGAMIGS, and Lemniscate, which is coming soon, which also won Best Gameplay at MEGAMIGS last year.
Thank you, Zac. And finally, not least, let me introduce you to Richard Henkel. Richard, who has recently returned actually to Canada to become CEO of Odyssey Interactive, a new game dev studio that he founded with 3 former peers and friends from Riot Games. Richard, happy to see you again. How are you?
Doing well. Sorry, it looks like I'm in like a back alley. Apparently there's like a motion sensor in this room for the light, but yeah, it's great to be here.
As long as you're not attacked by anyone, it's gonna be fine. Yeah. Tell us, what can you tell us about your new venture, Richard?
Yeah, so it's a company that I started with 3 of my friends and peers from Riot, some of whom I worked with as leads on Summoners Rift gameplay or the League of Legends balance team, some may know it, and then some who I worked with as like a co-lead for Teamfight Tactics, which we built and shipped last year. And then, yeah, recently it was like, man, working on a game real fast with a real small team was pretty freaking fun. Let's see if we can try to do it kind of like on our own and like see if we can punch above our weight and make a difference in gaming. So yeah, right now we're like 6 months in, brand new game studio.
And still have fun.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, still have a shit ton of fun. Try to keep it PG. Oops. Still have lots of fun. Community, let's go.
Okay, good. Thank you. So thank you for being with us, the 3 of you. To begin, I want to start with a question that might seem obvious, at first glance, but so everybody agrees, to say that community building and engagement is a cornerstone for success in any video game, and even further, in implementing a successful dev studio. So I guess I have 2 questions. In your views, why is it that's so important, and especially in the world of video games? I mean, there's no other art form practices, that practices community management so intensively as we do in the video game industry. So I just wanted to hear you about that, just to break the ice. Would you like to start maybe, Zac?
Sure. So I think from my perspective, I think the first thing is it is something that we see coming in more and more outside of the games industry. So we see things like in the entertainment industry, things like Marvel. You look at the MCU, you look at the way they handle their social media accounts, the way they do live streaming and content, and integrate the talent with the sort of the core community around those brands. And I think it's definitely something that we see coming in. I just think that video games are so far ahead of the curve and have been for so long. They pioneered community management back before it was a real kind of thing. And they've always been pushing, I think, at the forefront. And I think it comes down to level of investment and level of engagement. You can play a game for anything from a few hours to thousands of hours, depending on the type of game that it is. And I think the amount of investment that you have in it is very much then, that then leads into how much people engage with it, and therefore how much we work with different communities to be able to support them and grow them and make them a cornerstone of what we're doing.
But it almost seemed to me that it's a 24/7 kind of activity. So Rebekah, what do you think about that? Because I can't imagine like a TV director, or a music label like engaging so intensively with their communities.
True. What I think is interesting about video games is the games. One, you're playing with your friends, and on top of that, it naturally becomes kind of part of your identity. So it's not something you easily leave behind. I was mentioning earlier, I identify as a runner, but like I don't attach myself necessarily very strongly to a running community. And if somebody insults runners, it's not really a big deal. But if I were playing like a multiplayer game, for example, with a group of friends that I knew well, I'd be pretty upset if they were also insulting all of my friends. So like the level of interaction, sort of the level of overlap, I guess, of gaming onto your actual life itself, I think it's a lot more sticky than most other mediums, just based on the social component. And you can do it endlessly. Like there's a lot of things that you can just play. I can't run forever, but I could play games forever.
Could you?
No, I couldn't.
She goes like, yes. What do you think, Richard? Do you agree with that? I mean, is really the level of the players' investment and the stickiness of those games that are so compelling to kind of continue that relationship with the game, afterwards, even after you finish playing?
Oh, absolutely. I think, talking about like the running analogy where it's like, identify as a runner versus like identify as a gamer. It's like in my time working on League, it's like we saw all the time that like people identified as like a League of Legends player, but then they identified as like a champion main, to the point that like you would see subreddits devoted to people talking about just the champion that they played. The level of investment, the fan art, the posters people would buy and print and put up on their walls. It's like games. Shameless plug, on our website we have like games you live as like our tagline, because like I really think that games are something that like for people that have invested themselves so deeply into them since our childhood, they're really something that we live. It's not just like a small distraction in our life or not just like a hobby. It's something that like is a core part of who we are and what we do, and it bleeds into like our evenings when we're playing with friends, going to the restaurant with people, talking, watching streams on the weekend. It's so core. And I think one of the great things about gaming is that it truly like traverses, borders and languages, ethnicity, social, economic status. It's like I was able to go to places like China, Korea, Europe, South America, and talk to players about the game that they loved that was the exact same game that we played back home. And I think like that's where like the power of community, you talk about like 24-hour management, it's insane. And to do it right is so freaking hard. Like I remember when I was on the balance team, like I would tweet out a lot about the changes we were making, and I thought I was doing a good thing. It's like, oh, I'm talking to the players, I'm letting them know like what's coming, and then people in Indonesia would be like, well, why is it that the Americans get their news first, because it's all English and it's all based in their time zones? It's like, well, because I'm not in Indonesia or Southeast Asia, but that doesn't matter. It's like this feeling for players of getting to to really have that level of investment and connection to the devs, which I think is just getting ever the more important the further we get into like, you know, gaming being like widely adopted as a medium for entertainment. So I was kind of rambling, but yeah, I definitely agree.
Yeah.
Community in games is huge.
But that's important, and we'll get back to that later about, you know, you're talking about the role, for instance, of the devs, but indeed, you know, who owns that in the company, and is it like a shared responsibility? But I'll get back to that later, because I just want to bounce back on that idea, you know, that what I hear is that you have those kind of core communities, you know, that are following a studio or a brand, and then you have those game specific or wider category communities and so on. And so not only is it very time consuming and so on, very engaging, but you also have those kind of different levels, am I right, of communities? Zach, do you feel like there's different, is there one better than the other? Where should I focus my attention and efforts? Should I build a community, a core community for my company, studio, or the game specific, or?
Yeah, but first of all, I think everyone's being very, very polite and just holding fire until you say who to talk to next. But yeah, so I think from our side,
I can do that.
Yeah, from our side on the communities, certainly with the internal developed titles that we've had so far. So all of them have kind of had millions of players and you know, huge kind of peaks and stuff like that. So there is naturally a community that comes around that specific game and has a passion for that specific genre, topic, and you know, type of game, really. So I kind of see it from our side as we have these communities, we have these kind of, you know, you might be into Elite Dangerous and into space and into sci-fi, and that's really what you're into, and you're not so much into the rest of it. Or you could similarly be the same into coasters or zoos or dinosaurs, and you know, they could be the absolute thing that you're super passionate about, or running. We don't have a running game, but yes, absolutely, it could be running. But then we kind of have that layer beneath where we have a frontier community as well. And we tend to find that people perhaps come for one of the games, really gets into it, and then sort of beyond that point, and we do things like, whether it's say a Gamescom, and we have a frontier meet where we have, obviously, all of our communities are invited and we do updates on all of our games, or whatever else. And so we kind of have this sort of additional layer that people will, you know, they might start by liking one game and then perhaps actually become part of a wider frontier community. But I think it really does depend on the type of game that we're talking about. You know, if certain games just simply wouldn't necessarily make sense to have an entire community and all of the community activity dedicated around one game, but other games will. And if it's an online competitive shooter, for example, that will have its own full kind of community around it. So, but I think one of the things for us that's very, very important is every single game and partner that we work with is still introducing that game to the entire community and everyone that we have that we work with. But whether they have their own kind of full community around that, kind of, it's different from game to game, I think.
Rebekah, I'd love to hear you about that, because on that topic specifically, because indeed Finji is kind of in that kind of core community approach, but with that idea, you know, of creating those that proximity among the different games you've been creating in the last few years.
It's very true. So when we actually started building our community, we'll just, I guess, go back to 2014, all of our work was very game specific. So we built a Night in the Woods community. We built an Overland community, because nobody knew what Finji was at that point. Because it's easier to bring sort of an audience of people to other games if you have an audience of people to bring. And especially when you started as indie, and you have access to Twitter, which is kind of what we had in 2014. That's how we started that. But now that we have all of our games kind of in one place, we intentionally use past titles and future titles to sort of increase the spread across all of our titles. So you can just show up to our Discord, which is Finji specific, and sort of talk about all of our games amongst channels, and also about bread and animals and whatever else we have sort of going on in our Discord that day. We even have like a game dev channel, because Finji's earliest community was game developers, because that's who we were as indies. That's what we built first. So yeah, we came from like a bunch of different spots, but like now the big focus is we have to build Finji, because like people interested in Finji games would be interested in kind of all of our titles, even though they do span genre. And that's
Can you see that? Can you see that crossover of the other? Yeah,
it's actually really funny. We watch it the most on Discord because we can sort of see it in sort of live. But we have Night in the Woods, which is like, a narrative adventure game about a cat with a mental illness on like a genre or a like 14-day experience. And we have a lot of furries as our fans, and people get kind of weird about that sometimes, but like we think they're cool and they're great. But we have sort of
nothing that's wrong with that.
We have like our Night in the Woods
Nothing's
audience.
wrong with that.
But they also engage with Overland, which is sort of a hardcore strategy game, which is like, make your hands sort of sweaty when you play it, and you're going to die a lot because it's a roguelike. But then we also have them engaging with sort of the chicory audience. And then we have Wilmot's Warehouse, where you just have a bunch of boxes and you're organizing them in this black space. But they're playing all of our games, and they're interested in all of them. And these 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different communities are having to engage with each other. And we've had some very funny moments when we have sort of like our Xbox kids coming in because of Tunic, and then they run into the Night in the Woods kids, which is sometimes the overshare zone. And then they're running into like kind of our older strategy audience, and strategy audience is like, who are these people and what's going on in here? But that's awesome, because you're developing a company community where like for a Finji community involves all of those people. And we sort of provide this space for all of these conversations to happen. So if a new person comes in and tries Overland, we have our strategy players kind of like hand-holding them through and being really respectful of their first experience with the strategy game, even though they came out of, just a narrative adventure. And it's kind of
so they welcome the newcomers to the Discord space. That's interesting. And what about you, Richard? This is very interesting. You are building your own studio right now. So, hearing about, that whole idea of building a community around the company, and a strong one, and I guess it support also the discoverability of the games. That's what I'm hearing, and so on. So what's the part you want that to play in the way you're going to be building Odyssey?
Yeah,
Tell
it's
us
very
secrets.
I think like a lot of it is stuff that we're trying to strategize and plan out right now, because like we're just little, 4 or a 6-person dev studio now, which is awesome. But I think like we're trying to extract a lot of the lessons that we learned at Riot. It's like I was drawn to Riot in the first place because of their focus on building community and trust with their player base back in 2009, when it felt like there was very few AAA studios that were focused on doing so. And that kind of like focus as like a company to be the most player-focused game company in the world. It was always a thing that like came into every conversation. It was the DNA of the company, and you could hear it all the time. And I think like what that led to, and why I want to learn from it and try to apply the lessons that we can, is like you saw like the fan base, or the trust form between players in the company, and then the company Riot, and then the dev team on League of Legends, and then the specific teams on League of Legends, and then Riot put focus on like building up trust within the communities of cosplayers and hardcore competitive players through esports, going in Reddit, and like building up trust around the world in these various communities, which made it easy when we worked on a game like Teamfight Tactics last year. We shipped it knowing that there was already implicit trust, that people would already move over and try it. Just we're talking about with Finji, because it's like the same thing. It's like, oh, I trust the developer, I trust the things that they stand for, and they're going to look out for me. So if we ship a thing, it's like you can rely on a lot of just like that, well, the trust that's formed for people to like give you a shot. It also means like you're able to take more risks, because if people trust you, you're allowed to take more risks that don't necessarily pan out. So for us, it's I think we want to ground ourselves entirely in like, how do we build up that real authentic relationship with community early on. Just before the call, we were talking about like next week we're bringing in like our first group of 24 playtesters to come in and test our games. So the first game we're working on, tell us, is this game any good at all? because we may learn that, like, our biases tell us that the game is good, but then we bring in people who we intend to be our target audience, who we want to form a relationship with, tell us that, our heads up our ass and the game's actually bad, and it's like, all right, scrap it and move on. It's like the best way to know if a game is good is have actual players tell you, because that community, that authenticity is what I believe ultimately leads to great games. Not this like, ooh, I've got this perfect idea in my head, I'm gonna go away and we're gonna build it as a team and then release it and it's gonna be great. It's like, no, like games are an iterative process, and devs are basically just players that have some technical like execution expertise that they can take an idea from their head and put it into an engine that you can then interact with. But it's that community that helps validate that idea and make it truly become a reality. Because like if you ship it and no one cares, even if it's a great game, it doesn't ultimately matter. It's that community.
So I guess on that matter, you're quite, you all agree on what Haley actually was telling us before, to actually, kind of embed the community building and engagement from very, very early stages, in the development or design phases. Zac, you're like nodding, yes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, when we look at our games, they've all followed a very similar model to that. I mean, Elite Dangerous was a Kickstarter that then had an alpha and had an alpha community, and then grew into having beta communities, and even things like Planet Coaster, we had a tiered staged alpha with an early build that players could get in, and then we'd have clear drops of content that they were all a part of. So I think definitely involving community and players in whatever capacity that you can, whether it's through betas or whether it's through other forms, is super, super useful.
So I would like to throw in there a question from the audience, and you will excuse me, don't worry if sometimes, I bring my site down. It's because I'm looking at my second screen just to see how audience is reacting to what you guys are bringing up. So Vincent is telling us that it does make a lot of sense, obviously, to have a strong community building task force to succeed and building a good following and engagement. But how can smaller devs that might only have one CM, if any, be successful at it? Where to start? And that is always like a very important question. And I guess if you had to break down what are the core elements indeed of how do you craft a good and engaged and loyal community, where did you start? Where to start?
I guess I'll take
Rebekah,
that one.
go ahead. Yes, please go ahead. I'm sorry, I do have to develop also that. Go ahead, my dear.
So as one in indie who started out small and then also working with indies every single day on all of our independent titles, like this is something we do all the time. Night in the Woods didn't have an existing audience before their Kickstarter. Like it was the Kickstarter. And we didn't do content drops. We had demos that were only available really at shows only, like PAXs. We had an E3 demo once, maybe twice, like PlayStation Experience, because PlayStation was the partner. Like the audience was built on Twitter. It was built on trailers. It was built on probably Scott Benson's Twitter account, honestly, and that Kickstarter, which Scott was still updating that Kickstarter earlier this year. The game launched in 2017. There's no reason he needs to send out an annual newsletter anymore, but he does and did, because the game is not quite done yet. Like that's sort of the small. It's a small thing that has huge payoff. So when you sort of look at a title, like, and all titles are different. Audience building for Overland, we did have a first access or an early access. We ran it over on itch.io. For Tunic, it's been a lot of show, a lot of Twitter drops, using our partnership with Xbox. Even like early, like Day of the Devs, sort of show conventions, or going to the Mix when that was a thing at shows that you could do. And that was, I know all this is like when there was a show. There is this version now, but it is digital.
Once upon a time. I know. So it feels weird.
Things now, you can have a demo. You can participate in Steam demo days. That's a really big one right now. And doing that seriously. So making sure you're ready to stream your demo or getting somebody to stream it, have content to sort of be available on Steam while that goes on. There's a thing that I'm doing even with our studio. We just had our first show this week. We stream now every Tuesday night. It's an entertainment show, not just a dev stream. And we're doing that because I have a couple of employees who love to stream. So there are so many small things that you can do. There's not one big thing as a small studio, and it changes depending on your genre. I couldn't spoil Night in the Woods story. I couldn't show a ton of artwork. We could use only the assets that we had available, and we had to run with it in other ways, which was sort of building kind of this alternative community that identified with the characters in some way. Whereas with Overland, it was a strategy community early on and stayed a strategy community when we launched. And then we branched out from that.
Interesting. Zac, you are part of a much bigger company. And what would be your answer, to Vincent about that? I mean, where do you start? What you, as Frontier Foundry, you actually work with third-party studios. So how do you support those maybe smaller devs, to actually craft and start building their community? How do you support them?
Sure. I think, so I mean, yeah, as a studio, we have roughly about 10 people in the community teams. We have 2 community teams across different games. But I think really it starts off for us. It's always starting about the strategy that you're going to have and how you're going to be able to go about it. So much to Rebekah's point about what games they are and how you're going to do it. But you have to split it down and break it down into so many different areas and ways to be able to bring those communities on board in a meaningful way and communicate in a meaningful way. But I think in terms of to help Vincent, where he's talking about how does he as a smaller indie dev go about doing it, I think the largest part there, because sorry, to go back a step, to talk about the third party side, you mentioned about how do we bring those and build the communities for them. Again, we already have a large player base existing that we can kind of introduce
Transfer
the game to
or,
and chat to.
yeah.
So we can introduce the game to millions of people through different communication channels that we have as a whole, for sure. But I think that for Vincent, in terms of trying to help him in terms of what he's doing, the games that we're talking about and that we're partnered with, the 2 that I gave the examples of, they were both already building their initial communities before we were partnered. So the fact that they were already here at MEGS, the fact that they were at E3, the fact that they were active in the different communities that we're in. And I think for Vincent, probably my advice would be the same thing in that have a strategy and look at what you're going to do, but it's going to be a level of prioritization. It's going to be looking at what is the most meaningful things that you can do along the way that will create real tangible benefit to your community that's going to be interested in what you're making and care about it. Start as small as possible. Like, don't worry about starting small. Like, start small and build. Get more and more people. It's that core nucleus that's really, really important, of people that are super passionate and super hyped about what you're going to be making. But definitely start by prioritizing and start with a plan and look at what you can do. And if you can double up with something that gives a tangible benefit back into the product as well. So, whether it is Steam festivals is a fantastic idea, or anything else like that, where you can either get players hands-on and you can see it and get feedback, much to what Richard was saying. Like, all of those things they are fundamentally super valuable to you as a developer as well. So I think, but there has to be a level of prioritization. If you are one person or you're a few people trying to make a game as well, then it's got to be what is the most meaningful ways of engaging for your game.
Clearly, I guess you have to balance the time that you're spending on your game versus responding to all of these tweets or chats, whatever. On that point, actually, let's talk a little bit about the tools, because interestingly enough, Rebekah, you were talking about the fact that, you started off from Twitter and then moved to, and now Finji has, their own channel on Discord and everything. I was curious to say, would you say, like, how those tools and social media platforms and so on have changed the landscape of community management as well?
Even when I brought on my community manager, we brought him on just to run initially our Discord because we couldn't figure out how to do it without him. I sort of had a PR person before we hired Harris, but Adam and I kept looking at Discord and we're like, there's no way the two of us could possibly figure this out and train up our moderators and everything else. And then we just started from there realizing, like, yeah, but why are we still running our Twitter account? Also, we probably should have an Instagram, and we are never going to stream. And our YouTube, like, there's so much stuff now that, like, when we finally put all of it together, I mean, even TikTok, like, there's just so many pieces that, like, I am running the company and Adam is leading our design teams. We had to get somebody else who had sort of the mental bandwidth to sort of see the opportunity with all of them, because we had a community. We just didn't have anywhere for them to be. So there was, Night in the Wood fan communities, but there was no connection to the actual developers. And same thing with, like, there were Tunic fan communities, but no connection. So we sort of, like, let these communities know, hey, our devs hang out over here, but please keep your communities running. But yeah, it honestly, it just took me and Adam realizing, like, oh man, this is like a much, much bigger job. Because also we were ignoring streamers. So we needed Discord and who was going to vet streamers and to build meaningful relationships with streamers. And that is a huge portion of Harris's job as well, which feels like it should be public relations. And my background is in that. It is not. Streamers are super fans, and you should sort of engage with them as super fans and not as members of the press. And that sort of change in all of our thinking made us realize, like, oh, this is like a whole ecosystem that sort of spins around each other. And Adam and I know how we engage with that ecosystem, and our community manager runs it and helps us sort of manage our, 30 mods and admins, and he talks to all the fan servers and sort of keeps this whole machine running as we get games out the door.
That's really interesting. I'd like to hear you, Richard, about just bridging on what Rebekah just told us, is how do you actually enable that ecosystem also? Those different levels of super fans being on different platforms, doing different types of activities. How do you actually manage, your product development in order to ensure that you're ingraining at each step the elements that will be used by these communities and according to whatever they're doing, whether they're a streamer, whether they're on Discord, whether they're doing other stuff, creating memes, whatever,
Yeah, I'll say, like, this is probably a question that'll be best answered by Seth after we're done, given what they just did with Spellbreak. But I think, like, for this, there's probably, like, two parts for me. Like, one is, like, we're so early on with Odyssey that we haven't had to go through this whole process of building out the entire strategy for how we manage all these various platforms. But at Riot, when we were working on Teamfight Tactics, one of the things we were trying to figure out was, like, how do we release the game and have it feel like it's a part of the community and that there's advocates who can talk about the experience and the team behind it from the get-go. And a lot of it came down to us, reaching out to streamers that were already involved in the genre that we were in, that already played League of Legends or trusted us, and then bringing them in and having them play test. And I think Rebekah put it perfectly. They're super fans. They're not like members of the press. You don't give them like a press kit with a rude Q&A. You have to build up an authentic relationship with them, because if you don't, it is so obvious. It's like when you go onto Twitch and you see, like, hashtag ad for a game, you immediately make the assumption, oh, they're just playing this because they're getting paid, not because they necessarily want to. Even if that's not the case, they may really want to play the game, but they feel like they have to because they're getting paid. I think, like, we're pretty savvy as gamers to, like, know what is and is not authentic. So for us, we were trying to, like, bring streamers in very early on to feel like they were part of the process as well. It's like they got to give us feedback on the game, before it shipped. They got to take footage of the game when it was very rough and feel like they were part of, like, the development stage. Now, unfortunately, that may not answer the question super well, but on the topic of, sorry, go ahead.
No, but I'm going to jump in because you've been alluding, and once again, about that whole importance of trust, building that trust relationship. So this is a perfect segue actually to a question that was brought up by Arun on the chat feed. And let me ask it to you, Richard. I think this is a good one for you since you've been talking about trust. So he tells us that for different reasons, we messed up with the schedule and had a lot of delays for bringing our game online, even, for beta tests. So how can we regain and rebuild the trust of the community? So what would be, is it a better move to kind of rebuild it from scratch, or that kind of, so how do you, because shit happens sometimes, and so how do you rebuild that trust? I guess that's Arun's question.
Yeah, unfortunately, I feel like all my answers are going to be so surface level because I haven't had to deal with some of this stuff before. I think like the closest analogy that I would have is like when I was working on the balance team on League of Legends. Very frequently, we would ship things that players would be vehemently in opposition to. They would hate us for, because we objectively in some way made the game worse for them. And for various communities, whether it was a champion subreddit where there was a VGU that went out, a big update that they didn't like, we made a balance change that changed the game and the meta in a way that they didn't agree with. It's like, that was moments that eroded at player trust. It was a KPI that Riot tracked for years until finding like a better way to track it more concretely, because trust is a very amorphous term. But I think the thing that we found to be the most effective at building up that trust with players, and again, sorry for Arun if this doesn't exactly answer your question, but it's just being as transparent as you possibly can be. It's like gamers are just like us. They're players. They have lives. They understand when things go poorly. And it's talking through what happened, what your commitments are to for the future, and then following up on those. Because I think like for us when it was, again, on the balance team, things didn't go as planned almost 90% of the time. But it was talking about, okay, what were our goals? What are we going to do next as follow-up? And then coming through on those promises and then rebuilding that trust. It's not something you just say, oh, sorry, we messed up. These are the things that happened. Forgive us. It'll be fine. It's showing the track record that you can deliver on those things you say you will, even if it's just baby steps. It's not like, okay, we missed our beta phase and the game is a month delayed. Well, it's going to ship on this next date. It's like, well, what are the micro steps you can take before then that you can kind of take your community on that journey with you as you get there?
Zach, you would agree with that?
Oh, big time.
You go like...
Yeah, I was nodding away. Well, I think it's...
He's nodding a lot.
I have a it's not a great saying, but I have a saying, which is that I think for me, everything that Richard just said is all about this kind of piggy bank of goodwill. And every time you do something, every time you're interacting with your community, and you always do it with honesty and you always do it transparently. And every time something happens and you go, hey guys, you know what? We've heard you. We've listened to this feedback and we've decided to, here's some of the things that we're going to take on board and then present back to you. How do you close that loop and continue to feedback? And every time you're doing positive actions, you're feeding into that piggy bank of goodwill. And sometimes there is sometimes something won't go the way that it was planned. Sometimes, you may be delayed on a launch, or maybe your servers have been down for a long time, but that's where you start to see that piggy bank of goodwill coming back the other way, and people and the community really going out there and reinforcing those supporting you and supporting the community. And I think it's the same as with people, right? You have to go out there, and you only do it by that track record. You only go out there by showing consistency in your approach. And I think the last thing that I would suggest is to go away and rebuild a community, because I think that people are smart. People know that that you can't just sort of close one thing down and then reopen it like a shop. It's like it's all about consistency. Just turn around and say, hands up. You know what? This is what went wrong. This is what we're going to do to fix it. Thank you for sticking by us and being so passionate. And that for me is the key part. And it's about consistency and building up that piggy bank of goodwill.
Rebekah, would you like to add any advice to that? So far, very good though. Very good advices.
I honestly agree with all of it. And the small things, especially from an indie team, can be really small things. It can be something as small as a Twitter statement. It can be something as small as you have a monthly newsletter. If something slips, it's perfectly okay to say, hey, I know you guys are really excited about Overland 1.2, and we really hope to have it done the first week of November, but the pandemic sucks, and we just entered CERT. Like, that's an okay thing to say to the people who are already fans of your stuff. We had to delay, nobody knew the original launch date for Night in the Woods because we couldn't ever announce it. But we actually put up pre-orders, and then we announced a launch date and then put up pre-orders a little bit later, and we were able to fix the launch date before we even got and we had to bump it 8 weeks. This was just it happens, and you can just say, I'm sorry. We messed up. You didn't mess up, but we did. But the game's going to be awesome when it comes out. And we are working on a development schedule, and we are not hurting people to try to get this game out. I was actually, I'm pretty good friends with Tommy Reffinens because indies, we've all been friends for years and years and years. But I was so happy when Tommy said, you know what? I have to delay Super Meat Boy 2 because I just had a baby and I have a family, and this game's going to get done, but I'm not going to hurt my family in order to get it done. And that was awesome. That's the kind of communication we should be able to have. Because things come up. Everything right now, it's a worldwide pandemic.
Take time.
The amount of trash that every game company has to go through right now to make a game, and I don't even know how AAA companies are doing with all the security lockdowns on just equipment and everything else. The pandemic version of this is a nightmare. So I'm not surprised. Everyone should just put on their grace hat right now and thank everyone for anything coming out at this point because of how difficult this is. And we are allowed to apologize and be like, I'm really sorry. There's reality, and then there's people, and people matter, and I'm not going to hurt them to launch this game. And people have grace.
Rebekah, now you're true. That's true, but you're opening the door also to another important question, and that is, how do you're all talking about the way, you're ready to handle with some level of frustration, obviously, from the communities, from the players and so on. But on the other hand, we're all also very aware, that sometimes those frustrations or other kind of critics, might kind of go and slip away and become toxic behaviors, toxic language, and so on. And that, I guess, is also another very important part of that that relationship we want to establish, you want to establish with your community. So how do you build spaces that will remain indeed safe, and sound and secure for your community and exempt of those kind of behaviors we don't want to see there?
One of my very favorite things that I get to witness all the time is no one from Finji responding to stuff like this and my fan community responding to it. And that change happened sometime in the last 2 or 3 years. I'm not even sure when, but I see somebody complaining, and then somebody else will just pop in and be like, oh, hey, let me help you. Or that was kind of out of line. And you see it even on our Discord, just not even mods will pop in and be like, hey man, that was out of line. Are you in here in good faith? And if they can tell not, then they will contact somebody to sort of punt them out. But it's nice when communities start to self-censor themselves and punt bad actors, because that's what they are. They're there to get a rise out of you. They're there to just sort of spew around insults. And we work in games. That's our life at this point. You're not going to avoid it, but it's really nice when you're able to cultivate a community that doesn't want the bad actors there in the first place. Because then you're creating your own sort of safe corner of the industry to do really beautiful and cool things.
And that must be very empowering also, even for the community members, to feel they can have an impact within the community, by kind of self-regulating or kind of ensuring that there's the whole space remains safe. Richard, would you like to add something to that?
I just think I would +1 the not engaging with the toxic behavior so hard. It's people are very passionate, especially in competitive gaming communities, it seems like. And the phrase like "don't feed the trolls," I think to me resonates like super powerfully, where it's like there are people who are always going to be there to get a rise out of the devs, who are going to tell you to go KYS for whatever reason, or hope you get cancer and die, or any type of lovely thing that you could be told. And it's like not engaging in that, not giving them the satisfaction of you replying to them, but instead replying to the people that are saying the great things and being positive, like members of your community, and reinforcing them, because in doing so you build advocates. And I think that goes into the last question as well around transparency and trust. In telling people what's going wrong, you arm them to become advocates within your community. So when something goes wrong, you don't have to be there every time to be like, hey, this is what happened. You have those people who trust you, who are your advocates, who can then fend off the trolls. And yeah, to me, it's like, that is such a, I don't think we're ever going to solve toxicity within communities generally, but there are, I think, very meaningful steps that we can take to making our communities more welcoming, and as Rebekah was talking about, self-policing, where they kind of take care of it themselves by just you giving them the trust of the information they need to fend them off themselves.
So Zac, what do you think of that whole idea? Because I honestly understand, how as devs, we could decide to not respond to that and let the community, but then how do we make also sure that communities of players among them, or fan bases, stay alive and accessible, that this kind of passion doesn't turn into creating barriers of entry to new members of the community? And this is particularly true as we move towards more free-to-play, accessible, open, diversified kind of new gaming communities. So how do you ensure that also remains open and welcoming, to use Richard's term?
Sure. Well, I do think that there are reactive and proactive things that you can do to moderate and make sure that that it is a safe community. That's absolutely vital, and I think it would be wrong to not make sure you have that responsibility as part of what you do. But I do agree this whole, what I call positive reinforcement and empowerment, I think is super important as well, in terms of fostering a really positive community. To give you some examples, some of our communities, so for example, the Planet Coaster community and to Planet Zoo, we have master builders. Master builders have created the most incredible things in the game, and they are absolutely the advocates of and the best possible creators in the game, and they've come to events with us, and they've been on our official live streams, and they do all sorts of stuff like that. And in Elite Dangerous, we've got things like the Galactic Academy, which is a player-driven onboarding, so that when new players join, they get an email saying, hey, why don't you come join the Galactic Academy Discord? And they have people in there that are experienced and can help them through and support them in that way. Or you've got, community groups, like we have the Hutton Truckers, and we have the Distant World Expeditions, where thousands of people go out for like 9-month trips around, because in Elite Dangerous, the game is actually set in a one-to-one recreation of the Milky Way. So they go literally as far as you can possibly go, and then come on back around, and they do these really long trips. Or truckers that come together, and they've literally climbed mountains for charities as part of what they do in the community. But again, these are fantastic stories and fantastic examples of communities that have come together around, a passion around your game, but do so much more. And that's if by empowering them, then you're giving that positive reinforcement. And it could be anything. It could be, hey, you're doing a charity drive. Great, let's put it in the newsletter, because that's a really fantastic thing to do. So the positive reinforcement helps continuously drive the type of positive behavior, I think, that you want in the community. Okay,
duly noted. Was that a hand you rose, Richard?
Yes, it was. To know how to do this well. Like on the note of being proactive.
I see you.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Jump in.
There's also a lot of proactive things you can do as a developer when thinking about how you make your game. It's like, for me, it's like right now we're thinking very heavily about like, how do we make like diverse, inclusive audiences within multiplayer competitive games? And like a lot of that is like, well, is it possible to make a game that doesn't require text-based chat or doesn't require voice-based chat? Because like the minute you open up either of those two doors, that's a Pandora's box of toxicity just waiting to happen. You can create a bunch of tooling to try to like filter chat messages, but players, if nothing else, are incredibly creative at finding ways to subvert rules that you put in place to protect them from themselves. It's like, I think of a game like Rocket League. I think Rocket League did a remarkable job in like, the worst you can do is BM someone with like a predefined text string that just says like nice save right after you scored. So you just spam the chat with nice save after you just they obviously didn't save it. You've got Apex Legends with contextual-based pings, where suddenly you could communicate with complete strangers without needing to be in voice or without needing to type. It was just you ping an object and it says, I'm on my way, or machine gun here. It's like that type of stuff I think is so powerful from the beginning at removing it from the game. And then taking it one step further, it's like as the developer, as the studio, building your studio with that mindset too. Not hiring people who may be considered brilliant assholes or toxic, and forming a community within your own organization of people that are trying to reinforce positive behaviors in the games you make and then in the communities that spawn from them. So I think it's like there's the reactive things which we started the conversation on, and how you police and how you make sure that bad things don't happen over here, but there's a lot we can do upstream that just prevent those moments from even occurring. Not to say it's perfect, but this is like a war that we're
once again putting that, ingraining that very, very early stage. You won't believe me, but we run out of time already. This went like it was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. But Rebekah, I will finish one question for you, and this is, so I would love to hear about what's the kind of lessons that, interacting with the player communities and the communities actually taught you about a better in-house communications with your own teams and within the company?
This actually piggybacks off of what I was just going to skip this final thought, but it kind of answers this question. When you're sort of designing your community, you have to think that you're not just designing it for yourself. When we put together our Finji Discord, obviously we make games. So there's going to be a lot of game chatter in there. But a thing that's really important to me is I am not a game fan. So how am I going to hang out in my own Discord when I don't want to talk about a lot of this stuff? What are you providing for someone who is a fan of your game, who wants to be a part of a community? And that may mean that you have slightly more accessible channels in your Discord, for example. I mostly hang out in the pet channel in my Discord and the baking channel because I think they're really funny. But other people only hang out in super off topic because that's where the memes are, or there's people who just hang out in the game dev channel. Are you providing a space for people who are fans of your game who are also fans of other things? Because then you're creating an actual community instead of something that only exists as kind of a marketing tool. Because people can see through marketing tools. But if you're creating a space for you to hang out, where would you hang out with your friends? It probably wouldn't just be in the Overland channel. It would probably be something way more robust. So you'd be putting together events and activities that aren't just game related. Like we're probably putting on a chili cook-off in December in the baking channel. Has nothing to do with Finji games, but that's part of a community that's accessible, and it'll encourage people who haven't been able to participate in maybe the PS5 launch chatter or the Xbox X Series launch chatter to participate in something else in the community in a really cool and positive way. So that's my sort of final thought, is like how accessible, how open is your community? And are you thinking about somebody that's different from you?
And then the game is a starter in that conversation. What brought you. Well, Rebekah, thank you so much. Richard, Zac, it was so much fun having you guys. Thank you for your insights and for your answers, and very great advices also for anyone who asked questions through the chat. And stay safe, have fun, and hopefully we'll get to meet in person in Montreal or elsewhere at some point.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Take care. So what do we have next? We are going to take a little break. Actually, we're going to have our 5 minutes break as usual, but I would also like to remind you that right after this break, actually, the activity we've planned is these breakout sessions. So that will actually be activated at 4:15 Montreal's time. So right after the break, you can join one of the many breakout sessions that actually happen under the breakout tab on Pine. So you can join the conversation and continue, sharing and talking about all the topics that were brought up by our presenters and guests this afternoon, and all the issues and challenges that you meet in your own companies, with community building or engagement or anything else related to business and marketing. That being said, I'll also expect you guys to come back at 4:45 Montreal's time again on the main stage, because we are going to have this fantastic fireside chat with Seth Sivak from Proletariat. So on that, I wish you a good break, time for a glass of water or a coffee, and see you later.